Hello everyone, this is Grandmaster Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com, bringing to you an online video. I'm going to begin a series on the games of Akiba Rubinstein. This is, probably you've heard of him, a famous player from the early part of the 20th century, one of the best players never to become world champion. And we're going to be focusing on his endgame. Rubinstein was famous as a great endgame player, and his games are really seen as works of art as far as like simplicity and good technique. So here we're going to be seeing one of his earlier games, one of his best earlier games from Carlsbad 1907. This was one of the first major tournaments he won. Although I think in this year 1907 he won 4 different major tournaments, which really put him on the scene as one of the top players in the world. This was his game where he won as black against David Janowski. We're going to see how he slowly outplayed his opponents from a pretty simple position, which we'll see is a really famous example of this. So Rubinstein was black. Janowski started with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. They went into 4 knights. And here, after bishop b5, Rubinstein played bishop b4. And you might know that he invented this move knight to d4 here, which is to this day considered one of the best equalizing attempts against the 4 knights. This is known as the Rubinstein variation. But he hadn't invented this at that point. So he played the classical move bishop b4, symmetrical line, castles, castles, d3, and now, as usual, black took on c3, keeping the symmetry is dangerous with knight to d5 coming. Of course, here black could also take on c3, but he chose to play right away the capture on c3. I did a series on the 4 knights called the Attacking 4 Knights, and you can check those videos if you want to see more about the theory. That's not really the subject of this video. So bishop takes c3, d takes c3, d6, bishop to g5, and queen e7. I believe it was also Rubinstein that created this rearrangement of the pieces for black in this line. The idea is that the knight on c6 is not so well placed, with the pawn on c3 now. Has nowhere to go, so it's coming to d8 and then to e6, which will not only fight for useful square f4, but also clears the way for black's c-pawn, but additionally it challenges the bishop on g5. There's another move that's also played now, knight to e7, or more likely played before capturing on c3, in fact, d6, bishop g5, knight e7. But okay, this time they were playing this, bishop g5, queen e7, which is sort of like the main line of this opening. And now white played queen to d2, and this is a little bit not quite a concrete move and not really necessarily useful. We're not sure where the queen's going to belong there. So here, usual move is to prepare d4 by playing rook e1. So white is ready to guarding e4, so he prepares to play d4. And then after, for instance, knight to d8, d4, and then c6, there's one way of playing which was to retreat both bishops to their original spots, and where they're out of the reach of black's pieces and not making not encumbering the d file. And white has doubled pawns, but puts his hope in the 2 bishops and slowly building up pressure on the king side. Ideas like g3 and knight h4 coming up. Or another way of playing, more recent, is to play bishop d3 and bishop to d2, but the bishop's there, where they provide some more support of white's center. But in this game, Janowski played just the kind of routine-looking move queen to d2, which doesn't help us support d4. Now knight to d8, Rubinstein continues with this maneuver, bishop c4, and bishop e6. So he's going to challenge white's bishop and trade it off, and then put the knight in e6. Bishop b3, And white's happy with this exchange on b3. And to be honest, I think that white's play, although queen of d2 is not maybe the most promising move, I still think white's play is pretty reasonable, and I don't think he can complain about the result of the opening at this point. Maybe white has some chances for a small advantage here still. White has these doubled pawns, but these are actually good doubled pawns and give white the open A file, which is fairly useful at this point. And in the long term, this bishop against the knight is still some advantage. White will also get the chance to push d4 before black can do anything. So white should have some hopes of a small advantage, although black's very close to equality. Okay, knight e6, bishop h4. And black played h6. And one thing here to notice is, well, maybe he wants to play knight to f4 to occupy this square. But white has a good answer, knight to d4, using the fact that this knight on f4 is hanging. Knight wants to come into f5. And if black takes, black can win a pawn, but now in this type of position, queen e3, and white, first of all, it's hard for black to hold on to the pawn on c3. Meanwhile, this pawn on a7 is hanging, but also white's center will become mobile with f4, and e5 is soon going to be a threat. So instead, Rubinstein was alert and played the useful move h6, taking the square away from g5 and getting rid of threats of back rank later on in the game. And now white played rook to e1. Now a6, and here, okay, a6 is a useful move, again, which black will have to play at some point to free the rook from a8. But now white made a move which doesn't seem necessary yet at this point. Bishop to g3 played, which released the pin on the knight on f6 without black having to create any weaknesses on the king side or go to any more difficulty with that. So I think that white should instead play d4 here, which is the thematic move to gain space in the center and put some pressure on e5. And here I think white has some chances for a small advantage. But he played bishop g3, and now knight h5. So now the knight's going to be able to come into f4. And now white played d4, and knight e2, f4. And here now we see that black has two knights aimed at the good f4 square, and only one of them can occupy it. Here white took the knight, and I think that instead of doing this, white should keep the tension. Play something like c4 or queen to e3 with the plan of perhaps doubling the rooks in the d file, and leave the black knight on h5 instead of, white's bishop on g3 does a good job of keeping the king side strong. And if black takes on g3 and then retreats the knight, compare this pawn structure to the one we get in the game. They get in the game, where the white g pawn is on h2. You can see that even though here there's doubled pawns on the king side, white's pawn structure is much better, much safer than in the game. f3 in particular square is not weak at all. So instead, after knight to f4, white took. Black took back, and now g3 chased the knight back, knight to g6. So the knight has had to retreat from its strong square, but this g3 move is a serious weakness in white's king side. Nevertheless, white's position is perfectly okay, and we'll see in a moment that maybe white has some chances for a small advantage still. Queen to d3. Black played queen to e6. Okay, black's plan is to play f5. So white stopped that, and then black played queen e6 to enforce it. And now knight to d2. White's knight is going to need to find a new spot. And here black played f5, and I think that white made a fairly serious mistake at this point, d5. I don't like this move at all. I think it takes off too much pressure in the center unnecessarily, too. I think instead white should take on f5, and queen takes. If rook takes, then black has some problems because some moves like f4 with the queen on the same file as the rook. So queen takes f5. Now queen takes, and something like king to g2 here, or some various other moves. But if you look at this position, I think that that white has a small advantage here. Black doesn't really want to take on d4 because after, let's say, king to g2, also h4 comes into white's plans as well with an eventual h5 trying to undermine the u-pawn. But let's just say king to g2. Black has trouble taking this. Has trouble holding the center because if takes, this only improves white's position. White has the e file here, and somewhat useful pawn majority on the king side, and black's knight on g6 in particular is badly placed. White's knight has some things it can do, like go knight c4 to e3 or knight c4 to a5, different possibilities. And otherwise, holding e5 as it is difficult because the knight will have to stay on its bad square on g6, and white can add the pressure with knight to c4, also h4 as I pointed out, rook a5. So I think that there's no reason to say that white is worse for cert, and a little bit better, in fact. But instead, white played d5, which took the pressure off of e5, and I think this made things a lot easier for black now. So queen to d7. You see that black has some small initiative on the king side already. White has to take on f5 because allowing f4 could be trouble for white. It would be all the play would be going one way on the king side. So white takes on f5, rook takes f5, and now knight e4. So on the one hand, white has this strong knight on e4, which is a very well placed piece. This is what white was aiming for. But on the other hand, black has some pressure on the f-file. If you can imagine that white's pawn were back on g2, or even better, if, as we saw before, the h2 pawn were on g2, you could say that white's position is definitely better. But here, black has plenty of counterplay because of the weakness of the white squares. These can play rook to f8, also has ideas like rook to h5 and queen to h3. And the knight on g6 is badly placed, but there are various ways to put it back into a better spot. So I think that, well, maybe white's not worse here, but it's probably a little bit easier already for black to play. So, okay, so now black played rook to f8. White played rook to e3, covering the f3 square. Knight to e7. So Rubinstein, several times in this game, we can see that he's aware of which piece is badly placed and looking for a way to improve it. Right now, this knight on g6 is controlled by the pawn on g3. So the knight doesn't have many prospects on g6. It did a good job by inducing the g3 move, but now it's time for it to look for something elsewhere. So Rubinstein retreats it to e7 with plans of perhaps moving the rook from f5 and then playing knight f5, or even in the game you see another plan altogether with that knight, which we'll be seeing in a moment. So knight e7, now white played rook to d1, and this move was a little bit questionable. Maybe white could get away with c4, but apparently he was worried about rook to h5 with the idea of queen to h3. Now maybe rook to f3 is possible, but queen to h3, white can actually trade, and then queen to f3 followed by queen to g2. Okay, that holds things together. So it may be that rook to d1 was somewhat of an inaccuracy. Move's not necessary, and the rook is better placed on the a file. Another thing that is after c4, rook h5, white also can play f3, with the point that after knight f5, instead of playing rook to e1, white can play rook to e2, and after knight d4, rook f2. Again, holding the king side together, and now there are some counter threats of f4, although the position is very complicated. But worried about giving the d4 square to black even temporarily, white played rook to d1, and now king h8. This was Rubinstein has seen that maybe the knight doesn't have such great prospects on f5, and he plans a different maneuver. Now white went c4. He sees that here, well, rook h5, rook f3 is clearly enough, because the king's on h8. There's already play for white because of that. Rook takes, queen takes, and queen's threatening to come into f8, for instance. So he wasn't worried about this anymore, although probably he shouldn't have been in the first place. But knight to g8 is now, after c4, is Rubinstein's plan. So this knight on e4 is a very strong piece, and he plans to challenge it with knight f6. Okay, f3 white played, a move which is going to be necessary at some point. Knight f6, rook to f1, knight takes c4, and here white decided to take with the queen, which looks natural, but it's also perfectly okay to take with a rook, and then the queen can go to e3, and white just basically waits. I think that there's no reason white ought to lose this position. But queen takes e3, e4 was perfectly natural. And here we have a position where, at the most, black has a tiny, almost microscopic advantage. White has these, double pawns. They're not weak at all, but there's a slight chance that black could roll up the pawns with a5, a4. And meanwhile, white has to guard f3, the f3 pawn. And white doesn't have a whole lot of play, but it seems like black really has no way in. And once again, though, here, now, surely white could keep equality, or rough equality, if he played accurately, but Rubinstein came up with a very mysterious maneuver, which his opponent couldn't understand, and which allowed him to increase his very small advantage, because white couldn't see what he was trying to prevent. Rubinstein realized which piece was not being used the best, and the rook's on the f-file. At this point, there's no other open file for black, and they're doing a good job of keeping white tied down to f3, but that one weakness isn't going to be enough to win the game. Meanwhile, something pushing a5, white can ultimately play rook to a1 and stop a4. It's not really such a threat at this point. King can guard f3, so there's enough pieces to guard f3. Rubinstein realized he needed to activate his queen and create play on a different part of the board, and so he played this mysterious-looking move, queen to d8. And this has been really praised. I don't think it should lead by force to an advantage, but it's just so hard to understand what he's even planning at this point. His opponent played queen to g4. I think around here, one thing he could consider is just playing b4 to put get his pawn to b4 and prepare eventual counterplay by c5, or he could consider preparing to meet black's maneuver by queen to e3. So some moves like rook to d3, king to g2, and I think that, again, objectively white should be able to hold the game. And certainly black can probe some more, but should be enough to hold the game. But he doesn't see, and few would, what Rubinstein's planning. So he played queen g4. Well, Janowski is kind of an attacking player, and maybe he's looking in the direction of the black king. And in general, there's not a whole lot to do. So he plays queen to g4, and now queen to b8. Now you start to see, this is a really weird move, but you start to see what the idea is. And the point is, queen is going to emerge on a7, and then come in c5, whatever, and start to threaten to invade on the queen's side, while also supporting the push of black's a-pawn, potentially. And now, with queen on g4, it's pretty hard to stop this. Okay, king to g2, white needs to get his king off the diagonal, queen to a7, and the queen is getting ready now to come in. And here white played rook to e1, has to guard the rook, and queen to c5. So black has made this four-move maneuver by his queen from d7 all the way, and now his queen is occupying a very nice post on c5. And suddenly white faces a lot more trouble. He has to guard f3, but he also has to watch his queenside. There's chances of a5, a4, even b5 could potentially happen. So, okay, queen e4, white brings the queen back, and he realized that well, after queen to b4, now black is threatening to invade perhaps on d2 at some point, and white covered the second rank. Now rook to f6, queen to d3. White's planning to play queen to c3, and here I think Rubinstein made a slight mistake. He made a useful move, king to g8, but I think he should have prepared for white's queen to c3, and in order to do that he could play a5, and after queen to c3, b6. And here, as we'll be seeing, white is not in time to play c5 and get counterplay as he gets in the game. And just compare this to what happens in the game. Now it's, of course, good to bring the king back with king to g8, but it was more important to stop white's counterplay. Okay, so now queen to c3. And black doesn't want to trade on c3, and the whole queen maneuver would be useless. And if the queen retreats, white gets to play b4. So we played a5, which is more or less required. And here white's in time to trade, and now plays c3. And trade off this pawn, which is, okay, black wants to take the a file, and white can't stop black from doing that, but at least he trades off this strong pawn on b4. And black takes, and now it's crucial for black to take over the a file. If black plays b6, for instance, rook a2, and white has absolutely no problems at all, ready to play rook a7. So black has to take the a file, and here white had one chance to get counterplay, and should have been enough to hold the draw. He played king h3. He should have played c5, and perhaps he didn't want to weaken the d5 pawn. But this was the only. This was a clear opportunity to get counterplay, and it should be enough to draw the game. There's different ways black can try here, but it all ends up being equality. Rook a5, for instance, white can play b4, and after rook a4, now b5, and white's got threats of b6, c takes b6, and then c6. So now, for instance, that's what would happen after rook to b4. And if rook to a5, with the idea that black is ready to attack the d5 pawn, here white should play rook to d2. And one possible variation, for instance, is rook to f7, anticipating white's b6 move. And now white can play c takes d6. C takes d6, rook to c8 check, and this forces a draw because of king h7, rook to d8, and black's the one in trouble because his d6 pawn is under attack, and b7 pawn is under attack if the rook guards. So black would have to repeat with rook to f8, and then the game could end in a draw like that. So c5 is, well, real natural move to get counterplay, but it's easy to, you should be drawing the whole game to make a slight mistake and miss the chance. He played king h3 instead and missed the moment, and now b6. Rubinstein played and stopped c5. And here white could try to support it again with b4, but black gains a move here to put the rook in a better position. It's going to be very hard for white to hold, although this was probably the best chance. So rook a4. Now, for instance, c5, pawn is hanging on b4, so c5 doesn't really work yet. And rook to b2. Looks like a good move here is rook to f7, stopping the white rook from coming to the 7th rank. And now, for instance, if white continues with his plan to get counterplay by c5, then takes on c5, followed by rook to d4. And c takes d6, c takes d6, and here there's no occupying the 7th rank. If rook to b5, black can play king h7, and he keeps an advantage. Will it be enough to win? It's not so clear, but the pawn on d5 is weak, and if that falls, black will be winning, and black has can improve the king position, start advancing g5. f3 is also needs to be guarded. It's definitely a good drawing chance for white, but it's also a very unpleasant defense. Now I think, again, white needs to try for counterplay, but Janowski underestimated the difficulties of holding the game with passive defense. So he played king to g4, which ends up getting the king in more trouble, actually. And now rook a1. So black starts to encircle the white king of the rooks. White played rook to b2. Now king h7, b4. So finally white starts looking for some counterplay, but now it's definitely too late. King to g6. And white played rook b to b3. If c5, now rook to d1, for instance, is this problem for white. So he, perhaps, but playing rook b to b3, he's ready to play c5 and meet rook to d1 with rook to d3, but black plays very strong with rook to f5 now. And here suddenly white's king, despite the small amount of material, starts to experience trouble. So white played rook to c2 because black's threatening, for instance, c5 threatens rook to g5 check, king h3, rook to h5, and now h2 is falling because if king g4, then rook takes, and h5 mate is a threat. And if king to g2, then rook to a2. So now suddenly white has to go back and trace his steps and move his rook back and guard the second rank. So it's becoming more and more difficult here to hold the game. In fact, at this point, it's impossible to hold by passive defense. But it's too late now. Rook to h1. This was another strong move. So black creates more threats against h2, and white can't avoid losing a pawn now. For instance, h4 is met by h5 mate. So that's and if rook b to b2, trying to defend the pawn some more times, then now f3 is not guarded. So one way is h5, king h3, and rook takes f3, and black again is winning here. White's counterplay on the king side and the queen side won't go anywhere. And finally, c5 can be met simply by rook to g5 check, king h3, and rook to h5 check. And king to g2 loses to rook takes h2. And king to g4, again, rook takes h2. And for instance, rook takes, and black threatens h5. Checkmate, so f4 is required. But then, for instance, h5 check, king f3, king f5, and black's winning easily. The extra pawn and rook to d2 coming. White has no real counterplay on the queen side. Takes, followed by rook to c3, for instance. Black can play various things. For instance, rook to d2 is probably the simplest. So instead, white played f4 to make some room for his king. Now e takes f4, g takes f4, h5, king to g3, rook to g1 check, and white's going to lose the f4 pawn. King to f2, rook to g4, rook to f3. If white, of course, plays something else, rook takes followed by taking the c4 pawn or the b4 pawn if white pushes. So white has to trade a pair of rooks. Rook takes f4, rook takes, king e3, king f5. So now it should be fairly easily one position. Not only does black have an extra pawn, but also his rook is very well placed. The only danger is the fact that white's pawns are somewhat advanced on the queen side, so black has to be careful that there are not some sort of breakthrough over there leading to a passed pawn with some counterplay for white. So white played king to d3, and now rook to f3 check, king to d4. And Rubinstein played rook to b3, which I don't think is necessary at all. I think simple g5. I mean, his idea is to force b5 to prevent white's c5 breakthrough. But I don't think that this is necessary, and it complicates things, although black's still clearly winning. I think the simple g5 was much easier. For one thing, black's going to be faster with a passed pawn on the king side than anything white can conjure up on the queen side. But also after c5, black has a rook f4 check. And the b4 pawn is hanging if the king moves back to e3 or d3. And if it goes to c3, then c5 is hanging and black wins easily. So I don't see why g5 couldn't be played. But rook to b3. White gave a check now on f2. It forces the king away to the side, which helps him a little bit. And now b5. There's an interesting here, if rook to a2, the idea of going rook to a7, black needs to be very attentive here, because if rook takes b4, white suddenly gets a lot of counterplay by playing king to c3, rook to b1, and then rook a7. And here, white's taking the base of black's pawn chain, followed by taking another pawn eventually, and it becomes a race, and who knows what's going to happen there. So instead, if white played rook to a2, black would have to play a nice move b5, which is a very typical tactical theme in the rook and pawn endings like this. And now, of course, if rook a7, black takes on b4 and then trades the rooks and wins easily, bringing the king over in time and then advancing. And meanwhile, of course, if c takes b5, then rook takes b4, followed by taking b5 wins. So instead, white played b5, and now the rook came back. White's planning to invade to the 7th, so black prepares his defense, but also cuts off the white king from coming to the king side. Now rook to f6, rook to a2, g5, so finally black starts pushing his pawns, rook to a7. Very important point here. With this pawn structure, white doesn't have a majority, but that doesn't mean it can't create a passed pawn. This is, with the pawns like this so far advanced, you have to be watching out for the tactical idea of c5 undermining. So here, if black just plays rook to f7, c5 is quite dangerous. There's a pin on the 7th rank here. So instead, Rubinstein first gives a check on f4, and this turns out to be crucial. First of all, forcing the king back, but also, most importantly, forcing it to the d file. The king has to go to d3 to guard the c4 pawn, and now back to f7. And here, white's only chance is c5, because, of course, black's getting ready to push on the king side. So he plays c5, d takes c5, d6, and now the point of rook to d7. So because of black's rook to d3, I guess you could say it came down a little bit more to the wire, although it was still well in control. So black uses the pin, avoids white getting a passed pawn, and now the game wrapped up quickly. Rook takes c7, rook takes d6, king to e4, black gave a check on d4, king f5, and now h4, making room for the king. Rook to c8, rook to f4, and then c4. So this pawn will divert white. White checked on h8. If white checks on c6, followed by taking on b6, then rook f2, and black's going to be far ahead in the race of passed pawns, and his rook will get behind the white pawn. If necessary, could sacrifice for the pawn while black promotes on the king side. And so white played rook to h8 instead, king to g8, now rook to c8. Again, same thing, rook to c6, check, same position. So rook to g8, black played king h5 now, and now h3. Of course, rook to h8 here, the king comes to g4. h3, c3. So the pawn takes another step, white checks similar times, but there's enough space, not enough space for the rook to keep checking forever. Rook to c8, now rook to f3. Black guards his pawn and also attacks h3. Rook to c6, rook takes h3, rook takes b6, now rook f3, and white resigned here. It's clearly he's much faster for instance, rook to c6, h3, b6, h2, and black wins. Hope you've enjoyed this game. It's one of Rubinstein's more instructive endgames. We see first this idea of creating another weakness in White's position by maneuvering Black's queen around to c5. He created a new prospects on the other side of the board because White's one weakness on f3 wasn't enough to achieve anything. And we see also a principle of the worst placed piece. Trying to find a way to improve your worst piece, both first the knight on c6 in the opening, then the knight on g6, and then finally the queen. And then we see this endgame where White missed his chance for counterplay, where passive defense wasn't quite enough. So stay tuned for the next video where we'll be seeing some more of Rubinstein's famous endgames. This has been Grandmaster Bryan Smith with JustLecture.com.